For centuries, the Dacians have lived in a strange place in Europe's imagination. They appear suddenly in Roman texts as fierce warriors from the forests north of the Danube. Then, just as suddenly, they seem to vanish after Rome conquers their land in 106 CE, defeated, absorbed, erased. That story is neat, and it is wrong, because history does not end when an empire wins a war, and biology does not obey the tidy lines drawn in textbooks. In the last 2 decades, a quiet revolution has been unfolding in laboratories, not libraries. From fragments of bone and teeth, scientists are extracting ancient DNA, genetic whispers from people long buried. And those whispers are telling a different story about the Dacians. Not a story of disappearance, but of survival through change. Not purity, but persistence through mixture. To understand who the Dacians were and why they still matter, we have to follow their traces across stone walls, Roman reliefs, and finally into the molecular record itself. When most people first hear the word Dacian, it is usually through Rome. Roman authors describe them as formidable and unsettling. Warriors who fought with curved blades, mountain people who resisted imperial control longer than most, a kingdom that forced Rome's hand. But almost everything we know about the Dacians comes from outsiders, written by those who conquered them. That alone should give us pause. The Dacians were part of a broader world of Iron Age societies in southeastern Europe, flourishing for centuries before Rome arrived. Their heartland lay in and around the Carpathian Mountains, a region of dense forests, mineral-rich hills, and strategic river valleys. This was not a cultural edge of Europe. It was a crossroads. Ancient sources speak of powerful Dacian kings, most famously Burebista in the 1st century BCE, who unified multiple tribes into a large and influential polity. Later, King Decebalus would become Rome's most stubborn adversary on the Danube frontier. These were not marginal leaders. They negotiated with Rome, fought Rome, and, for a time, forced the empire to compromise. Yet the traditional narrative has often treated the Dacians as a historical footnote. Once Emperor Trajan conquered Dacia in 106 CE, the story goes, the Dacians faded into the Roman population and disappeared from history. Defeat equaled erasure. Modern scholarship has been steadily dismantling this idea. Archaeology shows that many local settlements continued before, during, and after Roman rule. Material culture changes, but it does not reset to zero. Burial customs evolve rather than vanish. Rural communities persist beyond the withdrawal of Roman administration around 271 CE. This is our first correction of an old simplification. Conquest does not mean replacement. It means disruption, reorganization, and often coexistence. The Dacians were never a single uniform tribe. They were a constellation of communities linked by language, culture, and political alliances that shifted over time. Even in their own era, Dacian identity was fluid, shaped by trade, warfare, and migration. And now, a new line of evidence is forcing historians to rethink the question entirely. Not, when did the Dacians disappear, but how did they change and into what? But to answer that, we first need to understand the world they inhabited. To understand the Dacians, we have to unlearn another old habit of thinking. The idea that ancient Dacia sat at the edge of the civilized world, remote and inward-looking. Geography tells a different story. Dacia occupied one of Europe's great connective zones. The Carpathian Arc wrapped the region like a half-open ring, rich in forests, salt, and metals. The Danube marked not a wall, but a highway, linking Central Europe, the Balkans, and the Black Sea. To the east stretched the Pontic Steppe, a corridor that had carried people, animals, and ideas for thousands of years. This was movement country. Long before Rome appeared, Dacia was already shaped by waves of interaction. Archaeology shows influences from the Greek colonies along the Black Sea coast, from Celtic groups moving eastward in the late Iron Age, and from steppe-linked populations farther north and east. Pottery styles shift. Burial practices blend. Fortifications evolve. This matters because it corrects a second oversimplified narrative, that the Dacians were a static people frozen in time until Rome arrived. In reality, they were already the product of centuries of mixing. Even the language we associate with the Dacians sits inside a web of uncertainty. Ancient authors classified them among the Thracians, but modern linguists debate the details. Some see closer ties to other Thracian languages. Others argue for more complex relationships across the Balkans. There are even cautious discussions about distant links to later Balkan languages, though evidence remains fragmentary and contested. What is clear is that Dacia was never sealed off. Trade routes crossed it, migratory paths passed through it, and its resources, especially gold and silver, pulled in outside interest long before Roman legions did. This helps explain why Dacian society developed strong defensive traditions. Hilltop fortresses crowned ridges, watchtowers overlooked valleys. These were not signs of isolation, but of a region worth protecting. From the outside, Rome would later frame Dacia as barbarian, but from within, it was a landscape shaped by choice, adaptation, and long-distance connection. And this perspective prepares us for something important. If Dacia was already a crossroads, then any genetic story we tell about the Dacians cannot be a simple one, because the stones they left behind, fortresses, sanctuaries, settlements, tell us who they were in life. But to understand what they believed and how they saw themselves, we need to look deeper. High in the Orishti Mountains, stone walls still trace the ridgelines. They are not crude barriers. They are engineered systems, terraces, ramparts, sacred enclosures, and watch points arranged with care. These were the political and spiritual centers of Dacian power. Archaeologists call them davai, from the common dava suffix found in many Dacian place names. These were not just forts. They were hubs of authority, craft production, and ritual. Inside their walls, evidence of metalworking sits beside sanctuaries built with precise geometric layouts. Wood, limestone, and iron shaped into a landscape that fused defense with belief. Gold is everywhere in the Dacian archaeological record. Bracelets of astonishing weight, spiral forms hammered from single bars. Not merely decoration, but statements, power made visible, control over resources made sacred. Ancient writers noted this wealth, with a mix of awe and resentment, and it is easy to see why Rome's attention kept drifting north. But material strength was only part of the story. Classical sources also describe a powerful spiritual system centered on a figure named Zalmoxis, or Zamolxis. According to Herodotus and later authors, the Dacians believed in some form of life after death, and their elite religious specialists played a central role in society. Here, caution is essential. These accounts come almost entirely from outsiders, filtered through Greek and Roman assumptions. Some scholars see Zalmoxis as a god. Others argue he may have been a deified teacher or reformer. Some question how widespread these beliefs truly were among ordinary people. This is our third correction of a simplistic narrative. The Dacians did not have a single, fully documented religion we can reconstruct with confidence. What we have are fragments, textual shadows, archaeological hints. Still, the pattern is clear enough to matter. Religion, politics, and military power were tightly interwoven. Leadership was not only about force, but legitimacy, anchored in ritual and cosmology. These fortified centers also reveal something else: continuity. Some sites show long occupation phases, with rebuilding rather than abandonment. Layers accumulate. Change happens, but place remains important. And that continuity will become crucial later, when we ask whether the people who lived here truly vanished after Rome's conquest. Because when Rome finally turned its full attention toward Dacia, it was not attacking scattered tribes. It was confronting a structured society, anchored in stone, belief, and wealth. The collision that followed would reshape the region and leave scars etched into both history and marble. By the early 2nd century CE, the standoff between Rome and Dacia could no longer be contained by treaties or tribute. Dacia was rich, defiant, and strategically exposed along Rome's northern frontier. For the empire, this combination was intolerable. Emperor Trajan did not launch his campaigns lightly. The wars against King Decebalus, fought in two major phases between 101 to 102 and 105 to 106 CE, were among the largest and most carefully prepared military operations of the Roman imperial era. Roads were carved through mountains, bridges spanned the Danube, entire legions were mobilized not just to fight, but to occupy. The violence was real and devastating, Ancient sources describe scorched land and mass enslavement. Archaeology confirms destruction layers at several Dacian strongholds. Decebalus himself chose suicide rather than capture. In Roman terms, it was a decisive victory. And yet, this is where another oversimplified story often takes hold. The idea that Rome's conquest wiped the Dacians from the map. Roman victory did not mean empty land. It meant administration. After 106 CE, Dacia became a Roman province, complete with governors, taxation systems, urban planning, and military infrastructure. Colonists arrived from across the empire, soldiers from the Balkans and the Near East, administrators from Italy, miners from Dalmatia, traders from many regions. Latin inscriptions reflect this diversity clearly, but Rome did not import an entirely new population to replace the old one. That would have been impractical, expensive, and unnecessary. Instead, Rome absorbed what it conquered. Local communities remained, especially in rural areas. Farmers continued working land their families had known for generations. Craft traditions adapted rather than disappeared. This is our fourth correction of a long-standing myth. Romanization was not a switch that turned Dacians into Romans overnight. It was a gradual, uneven process. Some people adopted Roman names, dress, and language quickly. Others did not. Many likely lived in between, navigating multiple identities at once. Even Trajan's column in Rome, often cited as proof of total domination, tells a more complex story when examined closely. It depicts not only battles, but negotiations, surrender rituals, and the incorporation of locals into imperial order. The imagery celebrates conquest, but it also reveals continuity under the surface. Dacia under Rome was not erased. It was transformed, and transformation leaves traces. Not just in stone cities like Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa, but in cemeteries, villages, and family lines that never made it into imperial art. The real question is not whether Dacians survived the conquest. It is how many did, in what ways, and how deeply they mixed with the newcomers. To answer that, written sources and monuments are no longer enough. We have to turn to something far more fragile and far more revealing. Bone, teeth, and the chemical memory locked inside them. For a long time, the people of ancient Dacia were archaeologically visible but biologically silent. We could see their fortresses, their tools, their graves, but we could not hear their genetic voices. That changed only recently with the rise of ancient DNA research. Ancient DNA, often shortened to a DNA, is exactly what it sounds like. Genetic material recovered from human remains, usually bones or teeth, sometimes thousands of years old. Teeth are especially valuable. Their dense structure protects DNA like a sealed vault, shielding it from moisture, bacteria, and time. When conditions are right, scientists can extract fragments of genetic code and sequence them letter by letter. This process is slow and fragile. Ancient DNA is not a clean strand. It is broken, damaged, and incomplete. Researchers work in sterile labs, wearing protective gear, because modern human DNA is everywhere and easily contaminates samples. What emerges is not a full genome, but a mosaic, enough pieces to compare with other ancient individuals and with present-day populations. This is our fifth correction of a simplistic idea. Ancient DNA does not resurrect the past perfectly. It does not tell us what language someone spoke, what gods they worshipped, or how they identified themselves. It tells us something narrower, but still powerful: biological relationships across time. Mini-explainer: autosomal DNA, mtDNA, and Y-DNA. Autosomal DNA makes up most of our genome. It is inherited from all recent ancestors and is especially useful for detecting overall ancestry and mixture. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is passed down the maternal line only, from mothers to children. Y-DNA is passed from fathers to sons. Each tells a different, partial story. Autosomal DNA shows broad patterns of relatedness. mtDNA and Y-DNA track single family lines like threads through a much larger fabric. When scientists talk about continuity in genetics, they do not mean unchanged bloodlines or pure descent. Continuity means that people living in one region at one time share more genetic similarity with people living there later than with populations elsewhere. It is a statistical relationship, not a cultural label. This distinction matters deeply for the Dacians. The old narrative assumed that conquest meant replacement, but genetics allows a different question. Do individuals living in Roman Dacia, or even centuries later, show measurable genetic links to Iron Age populations from the same region? The answer, increasingly, appears to be yes, but with important caveats. Ancient DNA samples from southeastern Europe are still limited. Preservation varies. Some regions are oversampled, others nearly absent. Each new study slightly reshapes the picture. Results depend on which comparison populations are used and which models are applied. Mini explainer. Why sample size matters. A handful of skeletons cannot represent an entire society. Ancient DNA studies often rely on dozens, not thousands, of individuals. This means conclusions must be cautious. Patterns are suggestive, not definitive. As more samples are added, interpretations can shift. Science here is cumulative, not final. What a DNA does provide is a framework, a way to test old assumptions against biological evidence. And when researchers began placing Iron Age individuals from the Carpathian region into broader European genetic models, something striking emerged. They did not look like outsiders who vanished. They looked like locals with deep roots. To understand what that genetic profile actually looks like, we need to zoom out, far beyond Dacia itself, and see how European populations were shaped long before the Dacians ever built their first fortresses. When geneticists analyze ancient individuals from Iron Age Dacia, they do not look for a single, unique Dacian gene. That idea belongs to the past. Instead, they ask a more careful question. How do these individuals relate statistically to other ancient populations across Europe? To answer that, researchers use simplified ancestry models. These are not real ancient ethnic groups, but analytical tools, broad components that help make sense of deep population history. Across much of Europe, three major ancestral sources repeatedly appear. One comes from Western hunter-gatherers, the descendants of Ice Age populations who survived in refuges after the glaciers retreated. Another comes from early Neolithic farmers, who spread into Europe from Anatolia and the Near East starting around 9,000 years ago, bringing agriculture with them. A third component reflects steppe-related ancestry, linked to populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, often associated with the Yamnaya horizon of the Bronze Age. This is not a racial hierarchy, and it is not a story of replacement. It is a long record of interaction. Farming spreads and mixes with foraging. Steppe-linked groups move west and south and intermarry with local communities. Over time, boundaries blur. Iron Age populations in the Carpathian region, including those associated with the Dacians, fit squarely within this broader European pattern. Their genetic profiles generally show a mixture of these components, with proportions that resemble neighboring regions more than distant ones. In other words, they look local. This directly challenges another simplistic narrative, the idea that the Dacians were some genetically isolated or exotic people who appeared suddenly and vanished just as quickly. The evidence instead suggests continuity across the Bronze Age and Iron Age, with gradual shifts rather than abrupt breaks. Mini explainer. What admixture really means? Admixture is not a single event. It is not one group mixing with another at a specific moment. It is an ongoing process. People move, marry, have children, and form new communities. Over generations, genetic signals blend. When scientists detect admixture, they are seeing the accumulated result of countless individual lives, not a dramatic historical episode. At the same time, not all scholars interpret the data in exactly the same way. Some emphasize stronger continuity from earlier Bronze Age populations in the region. Others highlight evidence for additional gene flow during the Iron Age, possibly linked to movements from the steppe or the Balkans. These debates are active, and they matter, but they share a common ground. None of the credible models support a picture of total population replacement in Roman times. Instead, Iron Age Dacian-associated individuals form part of a long, connected genetic chain in southeastern Europe. This does not mean that cultural identity remained unchanged. Language, customs, and political structures can shift rapidly. Genetics moves more slowly, and that difference is crucial. By the time Rome arrived, the people living in Dacia were already the result of millennia of mixture. Rome did not enter a static genetic world. it entered a dynamic one, and Rome would add to that mixture, because conquest was followed not just by administration, but by movement. Soldiers, settlers, miners, merchants, people who married locals and raised families in a newly Roman province. After the fighting ended, Rome did what it always did. It moved people. Roman Dacia was not governed from afar. It was filled, organized, and maintained by human bodies. Legions settled near strategic points. Veterans were granted land. Administrators arrived with their households. Traders followed the roads. Miners were brought in to exploit the region's gold and salt, some voluntarily, others under compulsion. Inscriptions from the province record an extraordinary diversity of origins. Names and titles point to people from the Balkans, Italy, Asia Minor, the Eastern Mediterranean, and beyond. This is sometimes used to argue that Roman Dacia became demographically Roman in a short time. But this is another place where evidence demands nuance. Urban centers and military zones attract migrants. Rural landscapes tend to preserve local populations more strongly. Most people in antiquity were farmers. They lived far from inscriptions and monuments. Their lives rarely appear in stone, but they leave traces in cemeteries and settlement layers. Ancient DNA helps bridge this gap. Individuals dated to the Roman period in and around former Dacian territories often show mixed ancestry. Some carry genetic signals consistent with local Iron Age populations. Others reflect origins farther south or east. Many fall somewhere in between. This is not surprising. Roman provinces were engines of admixture. Soldiers married local women. Local men joined auxiliary units and returned home decades later. Children grew up bilingual, navigating multiple cultural worlds. This corrects yet another oversimplification. Romanization was not the same as biological replacement. Becoming Roman was often a legal and cultural status, not a genetic transformation. Some scholars have argued that Rome's eventual withdrawal from Dacia around 271 CE implies a large-scale evacuation of Romanized populations. Ancient sources mention administrative retreat, not empty land. Archaeology shows continued occupation in many areas after Roman rule ended. Genetics supports caution here. If the population had been largely replaced and then removed, we would expect sharp genetic discontinuities. Instead, what we increasingly see are overlapping layers. This does not mean that everyone stayed. Mobility was real. Some families likely left with the administration, others remained. Still others arrived later. Which brings us to the next phase of the story. Because after Rome, the region did not settle into isolation. It entered centuries of movement. Goths, Huns, Avars, Slavs, and others passed through or settled at different times. Each wave left cultural and, to varying degrees, genetic traces. The critical question is not whether these changes happened. They did. The question is whether they erased what came before. When Rome withdrew its administration from Dacia in the late 3rd century, the imperial scaffolding disappeared. Forts were abandoned or repurposed. Cities shrank. Written records grew thin. For a long time, this silence was mistaken for absence. It is now clear that the land was never empty. The centuries after Rome were marked by movement across much of Europe, and the Carpathian region was no exception. Groups associated in the historical record with Goths appear in the archaeological landscape. Later, the Huns dominate political narratives for a brief but intense period. Avars establish powerful steppe-based polities. Slavic-speaking communities spread across the region over several centuries. Older scholarship often treated each of these movements as a replacement. One people arrives, another disappears, but archaeology and genetics both suggest a more layered process. Settlements shift location, but rarely vanish completely. Burial practices change, but not always abruptly. Material cultures blend. Local traditions persist alongside new ones. This is not a clean sequence of arrivals and departures. It is a palimpsest. Ancient DNA from post-Roman contexts in southeastern Europe reflects this complexity. Some individuals show genetic affinities consistent with steppe-linked groups. Others align more closely with earlier local populations. Many show mixed profiles, suggesting interaction rather than displacement. This challenges another deeply rooted assumption, that the fall of Roman authority meant a demographic reset. In reality, populations tend to be resilient. Even dramatic political change often leaves biological continuity intact beneath the surface. Scholars continue to debate the scale and impact of these migrations. Some emphasize substantial demographic input from Slavic-speaking groups beginning in the early medieval period. Others argue that cultural adoption may outpace genetic change, especially in rural settings. Both positions acknowledge uncertainty, and both rely on incomplete data. What matters for the Dacian question is this. Across these centuries of change, there is no clear genetic break that demands a narrative of total replacement. Instead, the evidence points to survival through transformation. People adapt. They marry newcomers. They adopt new languages or customs. They remain. By the early medieval period, the population of the region was a composite, not Roman, not Dacian in any pure sense, not fully defined by any single migration, but not disconnected from the Iron Age past either. The old story said the Dacians vanished because history stopped naming them. The new evidence suggests something more subtle. They stopped being labeled, not being alive. Modern DNA testing has transformed how people think about their origins. A saliva sample, a colorful chart, percentages that promise to tell a personal story stretching back thousands of years. It is tempting to connect these results directly to ancient peoples like the Dacians. This is where caution matters most. Modern populations are the product of many layers of history compressed into living genomes. When geneticists compare present-day DNA to ancient samples, they are not looking for direct descent from a named group. They are measuring degrees of similarity, overlap, not identity. This corrects one of the most persistent misunderstandings. Modern people are not Dacians, Romans, or Slavs in a biological sense. Those are historical and cultural categories. Genetics operates on different timescales and different rules. In regions around the Carpathians and Lower Danube, modern populations often show genetic affinities with ancient individuals from the same broad area. This is what researchers mean when they talk about regional continuity. It does not imply unchanged populations. It implies that despite migrations, a substantial portion of ancestry derives from earlier inhabitants. At the same time, modern DNA cannot tell us what language someone's ancestors spoke in the 2nd century, or how they identified themselves socially. Language can shift within a few generations. Genes usually cannot. There are active scholarly debates here. Some researchers emphasize stronger genetic continuity from Iron Age and Roman period populations into the medieval and modern era. Others argue that later migrations contributed more substantially than earlier models assumed. These debates are healthy. They reflect expanding datasets and improved methods. Mini-explainer, why interpretation is tricky. Genetic models depend on comparison groups. Change the reference populations, and results can shift. Add new ancient samples, and patterns sharpen or blur. This does not mean the science is unreliable. It means it is iterative. Conclusions are provisional, open to revision as evidence grows. Another critical point is scale. Genetics can reveal population-level trends, not individual ancestry stories. A region can show continuity, even if many families moved in and out over time. Both things can be true at once. For the Dacians, this means modern DNA supports a restrained conclusion. The people who lived in Iron Age Dacia contributed to later populations in the region, but they did so as part of a long chain of admixture. There is no genetic signature that stops abruptly in 106 CE. There is also no single marker that can be labeled Dacian and traced cleanly to the present. This is not a disappointment. It is a more realistic picture of human history. When used carefully, modern DNA reinforces what archaeology and cautious historical reading already suggest. The Dacians did not vanish. They blended, adapted, and continued in ways that defy simple labels. The rediscovery of the Dacians through genetics is not really about the Dacians alone. It is about how we tell history. For a long time, Europe's past was narrated as a sequence of clean breaks. One people arrives, another disappears. New names replace old ones, and the silence in written sources is taken as proof of extinction. This model is tidy, dramatic, and often wrong. The Dacian case exposes that flaw clearly. Rome conquered Dacia. Rome withdrew. Other groups moved through. And yet, beneath these political and cultural shifts, human continuity persisted, not as a single unbroken identity, but as a biological thread woven through centuries of change. This forces a correction to another old assumption, that history belongs mainly to empires, kings, and armies. Genetics reminds us that most people were none of those things. They were farmers, herders, craftspeople, families. They rarely appear in texts, but they carried the past forward in their bodies. It also reframes the idea of origins. The Dacians were themselves the result of earlier mixtures. They inherited ancestry from hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and steppe-linked populations long before Rome appeared. In that sense, there was never a single moment of beginning, only layers. Some scholars worry that genetic narratives might be misused to claim ownership of the past. That concern is justified, but the science itself points in the opposite direction. It undermines ideas of purity and permanence. It shows that Europe has always been shaped by movement, contact, and blending. There is also a lesson here about humility. Ancient DNA feels powerful because it is new and precise, but it does not replace archaeology or history. It complements them. On its own, genetics is blind to belief, language, and meaning. On its own, history can mistake silence for absence. Together, they correct each other. The Dacians were once described as a people who vanished when their name vanished. Today, they stand as an example of why that logic fails. They did not disappear into nothing. They disappeared into everyone who came after. In that sense, the Dacians are not an exception. They are the rule. And understanding that changes how we see Europe itself, not as a mosaic of fixed ancestral blocks, but as a living process, a continent shaped by continuity through transformation. The past is not gone. It is carried forward, quietly, generation after generation. For centuries, the Dacians were treated as a historical problem with a simple solution. They were conquered. They were absorbed. They were gone. It was a story built from silence, from the moment when their name faded from the written record. What archaeology and genetics now suggest is something more human and more believable. People do not vanish when empires fall or rise. They adapt. They marry across boundaries. They learn new languages. They bury their dead in familiar ground, even as the world around them changes. Over time, identity shifts faster than ancestry does. The genetic rediscovery of the Dacians does not give us a final answer. It gives us better questions. How much of the past survives beneath later histories? How often have we mistaken change for disappearance? Ancient DNA reminds us to be careful with certainty. Each fragment of bone is only a fragment of a story. Each model is a lens, not a verdict. But taken together, the evidence encourages a quieter conclusion. The Dacians did not vanish. They endured, not as a single people frozen in time, but as part of a long, shared human continuum in southeastern Europe. And in that continuity, there is something deeply familiar. Because the same processes that shaped them, movement, mixture, adaptation, are the forces that shaped all of us. The past is not something we lost, it is something we carry.